It all started on what should have been a quiet Saturday morning. The kind of morning where the sun peeked through the blinds in long golden beams. The birds chirped outside the window, and the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. The community I lived in wasn't perfect, but it had its charm: tree-lined streets, tidy homes, and a neighborhood pond where kids often fished in the evenings. On most days, life here was peaceful. That peace shattered the moment I pulled into my street and saw what my neighbor had done. Karen, everyone in the neighborhood knew the name. She lived 2 houses down from me, but her presence was felt far beyond her property line. The self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood standards. Karen had a way of making enemies out of friends and drama out of nothing. If someone's lawn was an inch too long, she'd be out there snapping pictures. If someone left their trash bin out 10 minutes past pickup, she'd send emails to the HOA and me. I had been her personal target for months, though for the life of me I couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was because I didn't bow to her authority. Maybe it was because I waved her off the day. She tried lecturing me about how my car didn't fit the aesthetic of the community. Whatever it was, she had decided I was public enemy number 1. That morning, her latest stunt took things to a level I hadn't imagined. Across my driveway sat a mountain of freshly dumped gravel. Not a small pile, not something I could sweep away with a broom. No, this was a truckload. Crushed rock, sharp and dusty, dumped in a perfect heap that stretched from one side of the driveway to the other. My car was trapped in the garage. My weekend plans were ruined. Most importantly, it was clear this wasn't some mistake by a delivery company. The timing, the placement, and the smug look on Karen's face as she watered her plants across the street told me everything I needed to know. This was intentional. She had done it to teach me a lesson. That was her style: petty punishments, disguised as acts of righteousness. The irony was, Karen never considered the bigger picture. She never thought about how her actions might spiral beyond her control. Because here's the thing about my driveway. It wasn't just any driveway. My property sat right on the corner of the cul-de-sac, and running alongside it was the only access road that led to the neighborhood's water pump station. Most residents didn't even realize it was there, hidden behind some hedges and a utility fence. But that pump station was vital. It supplied water pressure for the entire community, including the hydrants the fire department relied on in an emergency. The access path ran directly behind my driveway, and any service trucks, utility crews, or emergency responders needed that space clear at all times. By dumping gravel across my property, Karen hadn't just blocked me in, she had unknowingly blocked the entire neighborhood's emergency access. At first, I didn't even consider that angle. My focus was on the absurdity of the situation, how she could get away with doing something so blatantly malicious. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I sat there, staring at the mound of rock glistening in the morning sun. A few neighbors walked past, shaking their heads but saying nothing. No one wanted to get on Karen's bad side, and I understood why. She was relentless. She thrived on conflict. She'd drag people into endless HOA meetings, file complaints, or spread rumors just to make life miserable. But this time, Karen had gone too far. As the day went on, word began to spread. People walking their dogs stopped to gawk. A couple of kids tried climbing the pile like it was a playground until their parents pulled them away. I stayed quiet, documenting everything with my phone, making sure I had pictures from every angle. I knew I'd need evidence because Karen would twist the story. She always did. Sure enough, around noon, I caught her chatting with a small group of neighbors at the corner. From the way her hands waved dramatically in the air, it was clear she was spinning her own version of events, probably telling them I had ordered the gravel and was too lazy to deal with it. Or maybe she was claiming it was some community improvement project she had taken upon herself. That was her usual playbook, 'cause chaos, then pretended, was for the greater good. But what Karen didn't realize, she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was how quickly her little stunt would unravel. Because while she was busy gloating about her lesson, the community was only a few hours away from a situation that would expose her pettiness to everyone, in the most spectacular way possible. It started with a sound, a low hum, growing louder as the afternoon wore on. From my backyard, I could hear it approaching. By the time I walked around to the front, I saw it. A utility truck. Painted in the city's water department colors, making its way slowly down the street. It pulled right up to the edge of the gravel pile and stopped. The driver got out, looking confused, then frustrated. He paced back and forth, peering around the pile like he was trying to find another way through. But there was none. The truck needed to access the pump station. And Karen's mountain of gravel was blocking the only route. I stayed on my porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The driver made a call on his radio, his voice sharp and clipped. Within minutes, another truck appeared, this one larger, with flashing lights. Neighbors began trickling out of their houses, curiosity pulling them toward the commotion. Karen, of course, marched over with her trademark confidence, acting like she was in charge. She started gesturing at the workers, clearly trying to assert herself. But this wasn't an HOA dispute or a neighborly squabble. This was city business, and the workers weren't interested in Karen's theatrics. That was the moment. I realized things were about to get very interesting. Karen thought she had embarrassed me. But what she had really done was cut off access to critical infrastructure. And as more trucks arrived, as radios crackled and men in safety vests shook their heads at the blocked path, it became obvious that this wasn't going to blow over. What Karen had done was bigger than me, bigger than her petty vendetta. Had accidentally set the stage for her own downfall, and she didn't even see it coming, and that was just the beginning. By the time the second city truck arrived, the street looked more like a construction site than a quiet cul-de-sac. Bright hazard lights flashed against the neat facades of suburban homes, and the low rumble of diesel engines filled the air. Neighbors began gathering in clusters, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between the mountain of gravel and Karen, who stood at the center of it all, as if she were the star of some bizarre stage play. I stayed back on my porch quietly, observing, documenting every moment with my phone. It wasn't often you saw a neighborhood feud escalate to this level, and I knew Karen's downfall was writing itself in real time. The first worker, the one who had discovered the blockage, was joined by a supervisor in a white hard hat. Guessy circled the pile of gravel, pointing, frowning, and talking into radios. Karen strutted toward them, her hands planted firmly on her hips, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed she still controlled the narrative. She began, gesturing at the gravel, at my driveway, at me. Her lips moved rapidly as she explained something, no doubt spinning one of her stories, but it was clear from the supervisor's expression that he wasn't buying it. He listened for a moment, then cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. He pointed at the gravel, then down the narrow access path running beside my property. His meaning was obvious. This road must be kept clear. Karen's smile faltered. For the first time that day, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. More neighbors emerged from their homes. Some leaned against fences. Others stood at the ends of their driveways, arms folded. They'd all been on the receiving end of Karen's antics at one point or another. But until now, most had been too intimidated to speak up. Now, though you could feel the tide shifting, there was safety in numbers. Watching Karen clash with actual city officials seemed to embolden people, and then came the turning point. One of the workers opened the rear of the truck and began unloading equipment hoses, gauges, and a portable pump. The neighborhood's main water pump station had apparently triggered an alert earlier that morning, indicating a drop in pressure. They were here to investigate, and Karen's gravel pile had effectively cut off their ability to do their job. The supervisor made another call, this one more urgent. 10 minutes later, a third vehicle rolled up, this time a marked city inspector's SUV. A man in a collared shirt and clipboard stepped out, his demeanor all business. He spoke with the crew, scribbled notes, and took photos of the gravel heap. Karen marched over to him too, still convinced she could argue her way out. But this wasn't an HOA meeting she could dominate. This was official city business, and suddenly the consequences of her stunt began to dawn on her. She crossed her arms defensively, her voice rising, but the inspector barely acknowledged her. Instead, he turned to me asking questions about the property line, the driveway, and whether I had authorized the delivery. I calmly handed him the photos I had taken earlier, along with a brief explanation that I hadn't ordered any gravel. The inspector's expression hardened as he looked from me to Karen. By late afternoon, the entire street was buzzing. The utility crew had called in reinforcements, and more workers were arriving to find a workaround. Karen's face grew redder with every passing minute, her authority slipping away in front of an audience she could no longer control. And then, as if fate wanted to add fuel to the fire, an incident occurred that changed everything. Around 5 o'clock, as the crew debated how to reroute access, a loud alarm blared from the pump station behind the hedges. The workers stiffened, rushing toward the gate, radios crackling with urgency. The neighborhood's water pressure had dropped again, this time more severely. Without access to the station, the situation could quickly escalate into a full-blown emergency. Neighbors gasped as the inspector barked orders at Karen, demanding to know who had authorized the obstruction. Her protests grew shrill, her words tumbling over themselves as she tried to explain it was just gravel and that she was helping improve the neighborhood. But no one believed her anymore. The crowd of neighbors shook their heads, some even whispering loudly enough for her to hear. Her credibility was evaporating. The inspector called in yet another department, this time a fire marshal, because if water pressure to the hydrants was compromised, the entire neighborhood's fire safety was at risk. The sight of a fire department SUV pulling onto our street marked the beginning of the end for Karen's charade. The marshals surveyed the pile, spoke briefly with the inspector, then glared at Karen with the kind of expression that could wither steel. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words was clear even from a distance. Karen had crossed a line. Now it wasn't just a petty neighborly dispute. It was a matter of public safety. The workers began planning how to clear the gravel. Quickly, but it wasn't simple. The pile was massive, and they didn't have the equipment on hand to remove it immediately. Calls were made to dispatch a loader. Meanwhile, Karen stood off to the side, wringing her hands, her earlier bravado gone. She tried to smile at neighbors, to downplay the severity, but no one was fooled. For me, the moment was strangely satisfying. Months of her harassment, months of her nitpicking and intimidation, all crumbling in the span of an afternoon. And the best part, I hadn't had to lift a finger. She had orchestrated her own humiliation, and now the authorities were taking charge. But things weren't finished yet. Because while the city was focused on clearing the obstruction, Karen's troubles were only beginning. The inspector made it clear that fines would be issued. Liability for blocking emergency access would be investigated. If damages were caused by her interference, she could be held fully responsible. The look on Karen's face said it all. For once, she wasn't the one holding the power. She was cornered as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the heavy equipment was called in to deal with the gravel. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. What had begun as a petty act of revenge had escalated into a full-blown public spectacle. Karen had wanted to teach me a lesson, but instead, she had put herself in the crosshairs of city officials, inspectors, even the fire department, and the fallout had only just begun. By the time the loader truck arrived, the entire neighborhood had turned into an audience. People leaned against fences, sat in lawn chairs, and stood in small clusters, whispering about what they were witnessing. It wasn't every day that a petty feud exploded into a full-scale operation involving the city, inspectors, and the fire department. The loader roared to life, its massive scoop cutting into the mountain of gravel with ease. Dust billowed into the warm evening air as rock after rock clattered into the back of a dump truck. The process was loud, messy, and deliberate. And every scrape of the loader's blade against the pavement felt like the sound of Karen's power. Crumbling away, she stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Gone was the smug smile she had worn earlier in the day. Now, she looked cornered, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Her eyes darting from the loader to the inspector to the group of neighbors who were very openly talking about her. The aura of control she usually carried had evaporated. The inspector kept close watch, clipboard in hand, making notes as the gravel was cleared. At one point, he even walked over to Karen, showing her a form that made her face drain of color. Though I couldn't hear the conversation, the stiff set of his shoulders, and the way she gestured wildly with her hands made the meaning clear. She was being formally cited. The fire marshal lingered nearby as well, his expression grim. He conferred with the utility workers, then with the inspector, occasionally glancing in Karen's direction. Every time he looked at her, she shrank a little more. It was obvious the stakes had gone far beyond a neighborly squabble. Blocking emergency access wasn't just inconsiderate, it was dangerous. Dangerous meant consequences. The removal took nearly 2 hours. At the time the last of the gravel was hauled away, the sun was dipping below the rooftops, painting the street in shades of gold and pink. The utility crew wasted no time after that. Hoses and gauges were run from the truck to the pump station, and workers disappeared behind the hedges to investigate the pressure drop. The alarm silenced not long after, though their serious expressions told me the situation had been closer to critical than they wanted to admit. Neighbors lingered, their attention no longer just on the gravel, but on Karen herself. For years she had played the role of self-appointed enforcer, bullying people into compliance, reporting the smallest infractions, and stirring up conflict wherever she could. But now the tables had turned. People whispered openly, some even laughing under their breath, their fear of her finally broken, and Karen knew it. Her attempts to explain herself grew, increasingly desperate as the evening wore on. She tried cornering a few neighbors, insisting that she had been beautifying the street or that it had all been a misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. Most people brushed past her with curt nods or cold stares. For once, she was the outcast, and there was no way for her to spin the story back in her favor. The inspector eventually approached me again, this time with an update. His tone was calm, professional, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Explained that blocking a designated utility and emergency access road was a serious violation. Fines would be issued, and further investigation would determine if criminal charges were necessary. I nodded, thanking him for handling the situation, though inside I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had crossed a line that affected the entire community. And now the law, not just the HOA, was holding her accountable. By the time the crews packed up and the last of the vehicles rolled off the street, night had fallen. Porch lights flickered on one by one as neighbors retreated into their homes, still buzzing about the day's events. I sat on my porch, the cool air settling in, reflecting on just how quickly the tables had turned. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared. Inside her house, her blinds snapping shut with an audible clatter. For the first time since I'd moved here, the street felt strangely peaceful without her looming presence. But the story wasn't over, because the next morning, envelopes appeared on Porch's official notices from the city inspector's office. Mine was a simple statement acknowledging that I had not been at fault. But Karen's, delivered in a bright orange envelope, was far less forgiving. Word spread quickly. She had been fined thousands of dollars for obstructing a public utility access road. On top of that, the fire marshal had referred her case to the city attorney for review, citing the potential risk to the neighborhood's safety. The news spread like wildfire through the cul-de-sac, and soon, Karen's reputation was ruined beyond repair. What she had thought was a clever punishment, for me, had turned into her own undoing. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and yet even as she faced mounting pressure, Karen wasn't done. She still had one last card to play, a desperate attempt to claw back the control she had lost, and that attempt would be the final nail in the coffin of her neighborhood reign. The neighborhood woke up different that Sunday. The usual quiet hum of sprinklers and birdsong was overshadowed by whispers and pointed stares. People lingered on sidewalks longer than usual, trading updates about the inspector's notices, speculating about fines, and chuckling over how the self-proclaimed queen of the block had been dethroned in a single day. Karen's house, once the hub of her self-appointed authority, now stood shuttered and silent. Curtains drawn, blinds angled tight, as if she could block out the weight of the community's eyes. But anyone who knew Karen knew one thing: she was never one to admit defeat quietly. By mid-morning, the blinds snapped open. Then the front door creaked, and out she came, Karen. clutching a thick stack of papers, striding toward the HOA's bulletin board near the mailbox kiosk. Her posture was stiff, her chin held high, as if sheer confidence could erase the previous day's humiliation. She began pinning notices to the board with an almost frantic energy. Sheets of paper covered in bold, underlined phrases like community standards enforcement and safety reminder. In her mind, she was reasserting control, painting herself as the hero who had been unfairly maligned. The gravel wasn't a mistake. She claimed it was a necessary improvement project that had been misinterpreted. She warned that false narratives were spreading and that the HOA would soon hear her side of the story. But the problem was, no one cared anymore. Neighbors wandered over, glanced at the papers, and walked away, shaking their heads. Some even laughed openly. After years of tolerating her nitpicking, people had finally seen her stripped of authority, and they weren't about to let her claw it back. The spectacle of the utility trucks, the inspector, the fire marshal had broken the illusion she'd worked so hard to maintain. Her last stand quickly unraveled. That afternoon, an official HOA email went out, not from Karen, but from the board itself. For the first time, they addressed her behavior directly, acknowledging the incident and clarifying that Karen did not have, or had she ever had, the authority to approve or initiate community projects. They went further, condemning the obstruction of emergency access and expressing full cooperation with the city's investigation. That email was the final blow. Karen had always used the HOA as her shield, wielding its name like a weapon to intimidate neighbors. But with the board distancing themselves from her, she was suddenly alone. In the days that followed, her isolation grew. Neighbors stopped waving, stopped humoring her endless complaints. Parents who once kept quiet for fear of her retaliation now spoke openly about how she had endangered their families. Even her closest allies, the few residents who occasionally nodded along with her crusades, melted away. No one wanted to be associated with the mess she had created. The city, meanwhile, pressed forward with consequences. Word spread quickly that Karen's fine was no small slap on the wrist. It was thousands of dollars, a figure that made even the most patient neighbors wince. Worse, the fire marshal's referral meant the case had moved into legal territory, blocking emergency access was considered a public safety violation, and while no charges had been filed yet, the threat alone hung heavy over her. One evening, as I watered my front lawn, I saw her pacing on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, her face a storm of frustration. She waved her arms, her voice sharp, carrying across the quiet street. But this time no one looked out in sympathy. No one rushed to her defense. The street simply carried on, kids riding bikes, sprinklers ticking, families grilling dinner all, while Karen's angry voice faded into the background noise. The rain. A fear she had held over the neighborhood was gone, and in its place, something remarkable happened. Without Karen's constant interference, the community felt lighter, more connected. Neighbors who had barely spoken began chatting in driveways. Small gatherings popped up at the pond. For the first time since I'd moved there, the neighborhood felt like an actual neighborhood, friendly, supportive, almost like the gravel incident had jolted everyone into remembering what mattered. As for me, I never had to lift a finger for revenge. Karen had done it all herself. She wanted to trap me, humiliate me, teach me a lesson. But in her arrogance, she ended up trapping herself, cutting off emergency access and drawing the attention of people far more powerful than the HOA. The pile of gravel was gone, but its memory lingered. Neighbors still referred to it in hushed tones or with stifled laughter. Remember the gravel? Came the shorthand for the day? Karen lost her grip on the community. And Karen? She never quite recovered. She kept to herself more after that. Her attempts at regaining control met with silence or outright dismissal. Her voice, once loud enough to command the street, had become little more than background noise. In the end, her lesson had backfired spectacularly. The driveway she thought she'd blocked became the very stage where her authority crumbled. And the community she'd tried to rule finally saw her for what she was, a petty neighbor whose schemes had gone too far. For me, the satisfaction wasn't in watching her punished, but in seeing the neighborhood finally free from her grip. Karen had tried to bury me under a pile of rocks. Instead, she buried her own reputation, and that was the biggest mistake she ever made.